Hi, welcome to Lessons with Laura. I'm Laura Ingalls Gunn. If you're new here, Lessons with Laura is an educational series that I began approximately 4 years ago. And I look at various chapters of the Little House books that were written by Laura Ingalls Wilder. And you can find the playlist of all the previous videos down below in the description box. I think there's about 12 or 14 videos that I've done previously. Today we are going to be reading an excerpt from the book On the Banks of Plum Creek, and it is chapter 24 titled Going to Church. And this particular passage talks about Ma in her new dress. They hurried down, then they stood and stared at Ma. She was perfectly beautiful in her new dress. It was black and white calico, a narrow stripe of white, then a wider stripe of black lines and white lines, no wider than the threads. Up the front, it was buttoned with black buttons, and the skirt was pulled back and lifted up to puffs and shirrings behind. Crocheted lace edged the little stand-up collar, and crocheted lace spread out in a bow on Ma's breast, and the gold breastpin held the collar and the bow. Ma's face was lovely. Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes were bright. Now, we know from historical research done by Laura Ingalls Wilder historians that the Ingalls family, during the time that they were first living in Minnesota along the banks of Plum Creek, that was between the years of 1874 and 1876. And Ma was a very accomplished seamstress, and her mother had actually been a professional dressmaker, and I'm sure that Ma learned her needlework skills from her mom. And we know that the Ingalls were not a very wealthy family. So armed with those two types of facts, I started doing some research as to what Ma's dress would have looked like. Now, if you've been following me for any length of time, you might be aware that for the last 5 years, I know it's taking forever, I have been researching historical fashions and trying to find out from historical references what the dresses that Laura so beautifully described in her Little House books would have perhaps looked like. And based on that research, I have then been trying to recreate some of those dresses, and I hope that the book will be coming out in 2024. And there's our Grace. Grace, if you don't know, is my little dachshund, and she always has quite a bit to say. So we're just gonna keep going. So based on some of the research that I found, the popular dresses of that time were from the first bustle era. And the first bustle era, the timeline is approximately 1869 to 1876. So that absolutely places the timeline of fashion in that first bustle era. And some of the popular styles were the polonaise or the Dolly Varden style dress. And these dresses often had a plain skirt that might have a flounce on the bottom, as well as an overskirt, which is also sometimes referred to as an apron. And then a lot of fabric was bustled up or gathered in poofs and shearings on the back side of the dresses. And for Ma, even if you think about fashion today, the fashion that you see in runway shows in Paris, or the fashion that's worn by influencers of today, are not necessarily what your everyday person would wear. It's often much watered down. You know, if you've ever seen the movie The Devil Wears Prada, the character played by Meryl Streep beautifully explains how Andy's cerulean blue sweater came to be in fashion, and it was based on this runway collection that just got more and more trickled down until an everyday person was wearing that particular shade. Well, in terms of what was or who was the influencers in Laura's day, we know that Ma often looked at women's fashion magazines. The books sometimes specifically mention Godey's magazines. It also might be pronounced Godet. It just depends on who you're talking to. And so some of the fashions in the ladies' magazines would have also included fashions that would have been worn for outdoor activities, such as a seaside costume or a walking dress. And those particular styles of fashions would have been a better fit for where Caroline Ingalls was living and what some of her tasks that she needed to accomplish. She wouldn't have wanted a long train, which, you know, her skirt probably would have been street length, which that would have been right at her boot tops or maybe at her ankles. And so I was specifically looking at historical fashions that perhaps would have been in a style that maybe Carolyn would have gravitated towards. And in the fashion magazines, they would often include a pattern. And there were different types of pattern formulas that you could use, and I'm sure Ma was very well educated in taking the patterns that were listed in the magazines and then putting them on to perhaps the newsprint from a newspaper that Pa had read, or maybe some brown wrapping paper that goods that she had purchased from the mercantile would have been wrapped in. So, in thinking about what might the pattern had looked like, I went to patterns that I already had. Now, this is the 1873 Polonaise by Truly Victorian, and this is actually a pretty good representation, I think, of perhaps what Ma might have worn. There's definitely poofs and shearings on the back of the dress, but the one key element is in the book description. It talks about Ma's collar going up to her throat. So this wasn't quite right. And I want to say about 4 years ago, I had made Nellie Olson's Polonaise. And again, I will link down to the video and website post that's on my website, Decor to Adore, that shares that dress more in detail. And again, Ma's dress had a higher neckline, and that kind of goes along the line with this vintage gem. It's known in the historical costuming community as the croissant dress because of the big puffy side panels. It's actually based on a actual wedding dress from the 1870s. So it is a historically based pattern. And there is another Polonaise pattern which has a high neck, but this is dated to 1878. So that's a little bit beyond the timeline. It's too much in the future. The skirts are much more narrow in the later 1870s, and that is actually the second bustle era, which is known as the natural form era. And Nellie's Polonaise is very much from that era. So I didn't have any patterns in my own stash. So I went and paid a visit to Etsy, and there are several patterns that fit the bill over there. And I looked closely at a pattern by Past Patterns, which would have been good. But then I kind of settled on a pattern by Black Snail. Now, they are an independent pattern maker of historically based fashions, and Kennesaws had recreated this dress as well as Fresh Frippery a few years ago. So I knew what the finished dress somewhat looked like, and they both provided details, and I will link down to both of their blogs so you can read further. And it had the high neckline, it had the buttons in the front, and then the back had the bustle featuring poofs and shearings. It was also a style that didn't use a lot of excess fabric. Fabric was very precious and very expensive during this time period, and Ma, since she did not have a lot of disposable income, I was thinking that she would have selected a design that was fashionable but a bit more streamlined, and this certainly fit the bill. It is believed to be based on a historical dress that would have been worn to the seaside or outdoor activities, and the extant gown is part of the LACMA collection, and I will also reference that on my website and down below, and you can kind of see from the images that it really fit the bill. So in speaking about fabric and material, the one dress that I am often asked if I will be recreating is Ma's Delaine with the strawberry print from Little House on the Big Woods that she wore to the dance at Grandpa's. And the description of that dress is just so beautiful, and I would love to make that dress. But sadly, that sheer wool that was available 150, 160 years ago, it's no longer manufactured. When people read about individuals wearing wool in the summer, they automatically think with their modern mind, Oh my gosh, how did they do that? Well, that type of wool was so sheer that if held up to the light, you could see it. And so for that reason, it would have been a very lightweight, breathable fabric. And you know, the beautiful prints and florals that were available during the time that the Little House books were based upon, Ma would have had access to that fabric. The closest that we can get today to that, in Japan, they have sheer wools, but the designs are often very geometric or modern to our eye. Specifically, Laura does say that it is a calico fabric. And we also have to look closely at that term, because what calico means today is vastly different to what calico meant 150, 160 years ago. Now today, the blouse I am wearing, to our modern eye, this would be a cotton calico. It's a small floral print scattered all over, and you can kind of see that on this blouse I've made, there's two different fabrics that I used, and this is a calico fabric. Both of them are from the 1980s that I got from an estate sale. And that type of calico fabric you can still find online and at your craft and fabric stores. Now, if you travel over to the United Kingdom, what they refer to as calico fabric is more of like what we would classify as a muslin here in America. So just based on the timeline and where you're located in the world, calico can be very different. In Ma's day, calico often referred to the weave of the fabric, meaning the warp and the weft of the threads. You know, was there a design? How tightly woven? What was the thread count? So there's a lot of variables about what Ma's fabric would have looked like. And certainly the dress that I shared before that the black snail pattern is based on, if you look at it closely, that could perhaps be classified as a calico fabric. And black and white was actually a very popular color combination, as it is today. And you can kind of see that the fabrics, they are used on the diagonal as well as cut on the bias. And if you're not familiar with the term cut on the bias, that means that the fabric is cut diagonally. The strips of fabric are definitely cut on the bias on this garment, and that means that the fabric was cut diagonally across the grain. Now, as always, I am on a budget whenever I create anything, and most of my creations, I find my fabric and notions at estate sales and thrift shops. And why I do that is, number one, to save money. Number two, it helps from things from going into the landfill. And the fabric that I find there is often much better quality than the fabric that is produced today. So a few years ago, I found these two cotton fabrics at an estate sale, and I'll bring those in. And you can kind of see that I have about 7 yards of the floral fabric, and I think I have 5 yards of the gingham fabric. And this fabric is 35 inches wide. Now, our modern fabrics that are printed today are generally around 44 to 45 inches wide. And 35-inch wide fabric production stopped generally in the 1960s. So I know that this fabric is probably at least 50 years old. So I have to be very careful because of course I can't get any more. So I will definitely be making a mock-up or a muslin of the bodice itself to make sure the fit is correct before I cut into my fashion fabric. And I'm going to make the bodice out of the floral, and I'm going to cut the gingham on the diagonal for the collar and cuffs and the ruffles. When I go to estate sales, I'm not just looking for fabric. One of the things when I'm looking to create historical fashion is I always like to include an antique element. So I've gone through some of my stash, and I'll do a close-up of these buttons because of course they'll be a little bit hard, but they're glass buttons. Can you hear? And then you can also tap them against your teeth. So those are a really pretty option. And then I have another style which is a little bit bigger. And then there's always the option to make fabric covered buttons. That was very popular during Ma's time. Now, it talks about the crocheted lace at Ma's throat. And for this project, I have these two cards of the crocheted lace, if you can kind of see that. And let me just kind of hold it up for you. You can kind of see that. It's a little bit different design on each one. So I'll be using this. So first things first, I've ordered the pattern. It should be here within the next day or two. And then, oh my goodness, it will be time to start cutting out and fitting the mock-up and then moving on to the fabric. I am estimating it's probably going to take me around 40 hours to complete this garment. There will be some hand sewing involved, but I will be sewing a good portion of it on the sewing machine, and that is historically accurate. The sewing machine would have been well in use by this time period. Now, of course, Ma did not get her sewing machine until later in the series, but we're just in the essence of time, because if I did it all by hand, oh, that would probably take me 200 hours, because I am not a fast hand stitcher. What you wear underneath the garment is extremely important to get the right silhouette. And I do have a corset that I'll be wearing, as well as a chemise, and at least 1 or 2 petticoats underneath my skirt. And then the reveal will be on October 27th. So I think that's 2 weeks from now. So I definitely need to get sewing. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey to recreate Ma's beautiful black and white dress. For those of you who would like to be notified of future videos, you can hit the subscribe button that's located in the corner. And as always, I appreciate a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching.